10 shocking things that happened during the holiday season. Warning, viewer discretion is advised. This video is for educational purposes only. Number 10. Man dressed as Santa shocks eyewitnesses who say he beat up a 74-year-old woman. On December 11th of 2004, a man dressed up as Santa Claus stunned holiday shoppers. Police say he picked up a 2x4 and started pounding a nearby elderly woman passing out religious flyers. Elkin Clark, the man dressed as Santa, says the woman was stealing from him. "She was stealing my stuff. I asked 10 to 15 times not to touch my stuff." The man who called 911 said he saw the alleged attack. A guy dressed in a Santa suit had taken a board and swung and hit her and knocked her to the ground and proceeded to hit her again. Police say the woman attacked, Annie Ruth Nelson, who was 74, was knocked unconscious in the fight. She was taken to Grady Hospital. The suspect accused her of stealing boxes of Hershey's chocolates from him, worth about $145. Witnesses could not confirm the alleged theft. Number 9. The Tangaiway Railway Disaster. On Christmas Eve of 1953, the Wellington to Auckland Express was due to cross the rail bridge at Tangaiway when part of the wall holding the crater lake of Mount Rahubehu collapsed. A huge flood of water flew down the side of the mountain. A giant wave of water, mud, and rocks 6 meters high hit and swept away one concrete support of the rail bridge. At 10:21 p.m., the express, consisting of one engine, 9 carriages, and 2 vans, rocketed onto the weakened bridge. As the express left the bank, the rest of the bridge collapsed, and the engine nosedived off the edge into the air. The first 5 carriages followed, catapulting upwards before plummeting into the floodwaters. The 6th carriage teetered on the edge of the ruined bridge, while Cyril Ellis, whose car was nearby, and the train's guard, William Inglis, climbed in to warn the passengers and to move them out of the carriage. The carriage broke free from the remaining carriages and fell into the river, where it rolled downstream. Ellis, Inglis, and a passenger, John Holman, managed to get all the passengers, except for one, out through the broken windows and on to the side of the carriage. The survivors were able to form a human chain to make their way slowly and safely to the bank. At the same time, passengers from the other carriages struggled from the wreckage and made their way or were helped by others to the bank. Some freed themselves, and many were drowned or smothered by the river. Some of the passengers' bodies were never recovered. Soldiers from the army camp Wairoru joined forces with volunteers, but rescuing the passengers was very difficult and very dangerous. The water was full of rocks, trees, and wreckage from the train. Of the 285 people on the train, 134 survived and 151 died, most drowned in the water. Number 8. The Santa Claus Bank Robbery. At the time it happened, the Santa Claus Bank robbery was one of Texas's most infamous crimes and led to the largest manhunt ever seen in the state. On December 23rd of 1927, around 12 p.m., ex-convicts Marshall Ratliff, Henry Helms, and Robert Hill, and Louis Davis, a relative of Helms, held up the First National Bank in Cisco. Marshall had been caught with his brother Lee after robbing a bank. They had each served only a year of their sentences before being pardoned by the governor. Marshall and Lee planned to rob the Cisco Bank together, but Lee had been arrested again. Marshall got together Helms and Hill, whom he knew from Huntsville, and a 4th man who was good at breaking into safes. The four robbers stole a car in Wichita Falls and headed for Cisco. They arrived on the morning of the 23rd of December of 1927 and prepared to make themselves some quick, easy money, or so they thought. The heist went terribly wrong.
Leela Latch Lloyd was probably one of the first to see Santa before he entered the First National Bank that day in 1927. She had taken her brother downtown to see Santa Claus.
He walked up to Santa, and both of us shook hands with him. And Santa said, "Well, little man, what do you want?" He said, "I want that football that's right over there in that window because I'm going to make football playing my career." So he tried to pull Santa over there, and he said, "No, I have to stay here. This is my post. But I see the football, and I'll guarantee you that Santa Claus or Big Sister or Mother and Dad will get that for you." So we walked on with that.
As Marshall walked in, people's face lit up as they saw a man dressed up as Santa Claus. The delight turned into horror when the realization occurred. Hill barged in, pointed a gun at the bank employee, and yelled, "Hands up!" The other two heist crew members followed Hill into the bank as Marshall, who was still dressed up as Santa, shoved past the gate and armed himself with a pistol from under the desk. He forced a bank employee to open the safe, and he filled the bag with over $12,000, which would be equivalent to $170,000 today. Cisco Chief of Police Bitt Bedford and Officer George Carmichael were shot as the robbers left the bank.
Jasper Cook was in the 7th grade when the Santa Claus bank robbery occurred, but he remembers it like it was yesterday.
They were still going into the hardware store and grabbing guns out of the racks or out from the showcases or wherever and grabbing ammunition for them and hanging on the cars. We had running boards in those days on the cars, and carloads of them were headed south down Main Street, and of course you could still hear shooting.
Lewis Davis, one of the crew members of the heist, died of gunshot wounds he sustained in the escape.
Once out of town, the robbers realized they were almost out of gas. They tried to steal another vehicle, but failed. In the process, they left the stolen money behind and their wounded comrade. He was later taken to the hospital.
They had this fella in a room. Through the window, you could see him from the front, like a little porch they had on that old hospital. And it was just a constant line. It reminded me of a funeral procession looking at, the remains of someone in a casket. But they looked through the window at him. We all marched through there and saw him. And that's something that's stuck with me all these years.
The Santa Claus caper had inflicted gunshot wounds in 2 police officers, 2 hostages, 4 posse members, 2 bystanders, and 3 robbers.
O.L. Stamey had been in the bank 40 minutes before the robbery. He says many of the killings were senseless, but that was the way they handled things in those days. Just stop whatever started, any way you could.
Chief Bedford came in that end of the alley, and Carmichael came in that end of the alley. And if they'd just gotten on top of this building right here, they could have picked them off probably one at a time as they came out of the bank. But then these bank robbers came out there shooting, and of course, Bedford was a big man. He couldn't miss him. Carmichael was a big man, and they made good targets, and that's the reason they got killed.
The robbers dumped their 2 hostages and their gasless Buick and headed for the woods.
It took days, but all 3 of the remaining robbers were eventually captured.
Helms was executed for the murders of the 2 officers, Bedford and Carmichael. Marshall, however, met a more violent and terrifying end. While at the Eastland County Jail, Marshall was able to get a hold of a gun from a desk drawer and shot jailer Tom A. Jones to death. After Jones was murdered, a mob lynched Marshall and hanged him from a nearby light pole. Robert Hill was the only heist crew member who survived the Great Santa Claus robbery. He served his time and was eventually released. The building that housed the First National Bank in Cisco still stands. Number 7. On November 22nd of 2021, a horrifying moment shown on camera shows an SUV plowing into a Christmas parade. Police say that there were several fatalities and at least 20 injured after the vehicle mowed down attendees. Police Chief Dan Thompson said the vehicle struck more than 20 individuals, Some of the individuals were children, and some fatalities as a result of this incident. Bystander footage shows the SUV driving into marchers from behind, flinging their bodies aside. Other footage taken in the aftermath shows a chaotic scene as witnesses scream. Several children were seen lying motionless on the ground.
About 4:39 p.m., the red SUV drove into our Christmas parade that we were holding downtown. More than 20 individuals were injured as a result of this incident. The Waukesha Police Department has recovered a suspect vehicle. It's an ongoing investigation. Victims were actually transported from the scene via ambulance. Officers actually transported some of the injured personnel and took them to the hospitals, and some victims were actually transported by family members and friends to the hospitals. A very tragic incident, very chaotic. There is no other threats involved. The scene is now safe.
Police fired shots at the vehicle in an attempt to halt it. However, the driver was able to escape. The vehicle was later found parked at a nearby address, and police say the person of interest has been taken into custody. The person driving the SUV was later found out to be 39-year-old Darrell Brooks Jr. Darrell Brooks Jr. raps under the name Math Boy Fly, and a music video uploaded to YouTube shows him performing in front of a red Ford Explorer 4x4, the same make, model, and color of the car that was seen speeding down the parade route.
Hey, I called an Uber, and I'm supposed to be waiting for it over here, but I don't know when it's coming. Can you call it for me, please? I'm homeless. I don't know. It's him. Oh, yeah. My ID. Whoa.
26, 500 block of Elizabeth, 126.
Police say the man behind the wheel had been released from jail less than a week ago in a domestic violence case. Darrell Edward Brooks Jr. was free on a $1,000 cash bail that prosecutors now say they are reviewing because it was inappropriately low. Brooks' criminal history begins in 1999 at age 17 when he pleaded guilty to inflicting bodily harm. He has pleaded guilty, been convicted, and done time for drug violations in gun cases, domestic violence, and endangering safety, including obstructing police.
Other witnesses say that when Darrell was driving through the crowd, he was showing no expression on his face, focused and very calm. Number 6. The Carnation, Washington Murders. In 2007, Judy Anderson, 61, and Wayne Anderson, 60, had been happily married for 31 years. Judy worked for the U.S. Postal Service, while Wayne was an engineer for Boeing. Together, they had 3 children, Mary and Scott, who were 32, and Michelle, who was 29. Scott was married to Erica, who was also 32, and together they had 2 children, Olivia, who was 5, and Nathan, who was 3. The youngest daughter, Michelle, lived with her boyfriend, Joseph McEnroe, also 29, in a trailer on the 10-acre property owned by Judy and Wayne. The family had planned a gathering at the Wayne and Judy's house for Christmas Eve. What seemed like a relaxing Christmas Eve night turned into tragedy. Chaos happened in a matter of seconds. The youngest daughter, who was 29, Michelle Anderson, and her boyfriend McEnroe entered, each armed with a handgun. Joseph distracted Judy while Anderson shot at Wayne. Anderson's gun jammed, so Joseph shot Wayne and then Judy, the parents, killing them both. Joseph and Michelle cleaned the room and dragged the bodies of Judy and Wayne into a shed behind the house. Then they sat, waiting for the arrival of Scott, Erica, and their 2 children. After about an hour, the family arrived. Then, Michelle and Joseph appeared, and Michelle opened fire on Scott, shooting him a total of 4 times. Erica called 911 around 5 p.m. and screamed down the phone, not the kids. But before authorities are able to find out what was going on, the phone went dead. Michelle shot Erica twice. When Michelle found out she had run out of bullets, she told Joseph he needs to shoot the kids, who are screaming and clinging to Erica. Joseph does what Michelle says. With 14 bullets, Michelle Anderson and Joseph McEnroe wiped out all 6 of the Andersons' family members. In response to Erica's 911 call, authorities were dispatched to the Anderson property. But Michelle, knowing the police were likely to come, already locked the gate to the property. On December 26, when Linda Thiel reported to work that morning, she was surprised by the absence of her best friend, Judy. She left work and made her way to Judy's house, arriving shortly after 8 a.m. The gate was still locked, so Linda got out of her car and walked around it, approaching the front door. She knocked, but nobody answered, so she tried the other door, which was unlocked. Slowly opening the door a little wider, she saw it. The body of Scott Anderson lying motionless on the floor, dead. Linda then slowly saw the horror of what happened that night, as the other bodies were shown as well. Linda didn't have her cell phone on her, so she rushed into Judy and Wayne's bedroom and dialed 911 from their landline. The phone call between Linda and the operator lasted around 30 minutes. Linda told the operator that Judy and Wayne's daughter, Michelle, lived on the property in a mobile home, and that Michelle had been upset with Judy and Wayne over money. Linda worried that Michelle may have been involved in the killings. Police arrived at 9:30 a.m. The crime scene unfolded, and when an officer ventured outside to the shed, the bodies of Judy and Wayne were discovered. Around 3 hours after the police arrived, Anderson and McEnroe pulled up to Wayne and Judy's house. They did not seem fazed by the fact that there were police cars surrounding the property. Authorities immediately began questioning the couple. Anderson told them that they had been on their way to LA to get married, but when they got lost, they turned around and came home. Anderson also told the detectives that the last time she had seen her parents was Christmas Eve, before heading to Vegas. When a detective asked Michelle why she thought the authorities were at her house, she broke down. "It's not Joe's fault, it's all my fault," she exclaimed. "As soon as I shot the gun, I felt so bad, like, what the hell have I done? I'm a monster." The detective asked Anderson why the children had been killed, and Anderson explained that they would be scarred for life after seeing what had happened to their parents. Michelle was questioned as to why she felt the need to wipe out her family. She told the detectives that she was tired of everyone stepping on her, claiming that her brother Scott owed her $40,000 and would not pay her back, and that her parents had begun pressing her about paying rent money for living in the mobile home on their property. It became clear to the detectives that money was at the heart of this disturbing crime. The confession went on for nearly 2 hours. The 2 were arrested on the spot. Michelle led detectives to where she and Joseph had discarded of the 2 guns. On the 28th of December, the couple were charged with 6 counts of aggravated murder. In June of 2008, during a jailhouse interview with the Seattle Times, Anderson confessed to the murders once again. "I want the most severe punishment, which would be the death penalty. I think if I kill a bunch of people, I'm not sure I deserve to live." On the 25th of March of 2015, the jury found Joseph McEnroe guilty of 6 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. Joseph showed little emotion through most of the trial. This changed, however, when he took the stand on the 3rd of April of 2015. He was barely able to stand or string sentences together due to being so heavily medicated with anti-anxiety and antidepressants. At one point, he began laughing hysterically. When describing the look on Judy Anderson's face when he shot her, he put his arms over his head and began rocking back and forth uncontrollably. Towards the end of her trial, Michelle had an outburst in which she yelled at the judge, Judge Ramsdell, telling him she was going to file charges against her court-appointed attorneys, whom she was convinced had been lying to her. On March 4th of 2016, Michelle, just like Joseph, was convicted of 6 counts of aggravated murder in the first degree, and on the 21st of April was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
Number 5. The Sodder Family Mystery. Morbidology. On December 24th, 1945, a fire destroyed the Sodder family's home in Fayetteville, West Virginia, United States. George, Jenny, and 4 of their 9 children escaped. The bodies of their 5 other children were never found. There was nothing extraordinary about Christmas Eve, 1945, for the Sodder household in Fayetteville, West Virginia. The tree was decorated, and presents for the 9 Sodder siblings were waiting for the following day. Still too excited to sleep, 5 of the middle children asked permission to stay up late to play with some of the presents that they had been allowed to open on the 24th. Mother Jenny agreed with the understanding that before they went to bed, that they had to turn off the lights in the house and lock the front door. The children readily agreed. After a couple of hours, the phone rang and Jenny got up to go answer it. The caller was a woman who asked for a person Jenny didn't know. Jenny told the woman that she had the wrong number. Jenny would later state that the woman then laughed strangely and hung up. Before going back to bed, Jenny noticed that the lights were still on in the house and that the front door was unlocked. She thought at the time that the 5 children had forgotten to close up the house. She turned off the lights and locked the door and went back to bed. Before she could fall asleep, however, she heard a noise that she later claimed sounded like something hitting the roof and then rolling down and onto the ground. Feeling too tired, she did not investigate and attempted to go back to sleep. But before she could drift off, she smelled smoke. She quickly woke her husband George and ran out of the room only to find the hallway in flames. She shouted over the growling sounds of the fire, calling for the children to get out of the house and run into the front yard. 2 of the older boys did so, but there was no sign of the 5 who had stayed up late. Thinking that the 5 children were trapped in their upstairs rooms, George went for the ladder that was always near the house, only to find it missing. George then thought he could drive one of his trucks up to the side of the house, stand on the top of it, and get the children out through a window. But mysteriously, neither truck would start. Horrified, the family members who had made it out of the house, 2 daughters and 2 older sons, and the parents, could do nothing but hope that the children would soon run out the front door into safety. But the house burned to the ground without any sight of the 5 children. Once the firemen and police arrived, hours after the house had completely burned to ashes, they did a quick inspection and declared that the 5 children had undoubtedly died in the fire that was most likely caused by faulty wiring. But George and Jenny didn't believe that conclusion. They distinctly remembered the lights being on in the house while the building was burning. How was that possible if faulty wiring had been the cause? Also, there were no human remains to be found in the house, and neither had anyone detected the distinctive stench of human flesh burning. Unsatisfied with the official conclusions, George and Jenny decided to investigate on their own. Unfortunately, one of the first things George did in the days following the catastrophe was to cover the house's remains with dirt, stating that he couldn't stand seeing the rubble of the fire. This destroyed a lot of possible evidence that would help determine the cause and consequences of the fire. But slowly, over time, evidence started to show that went against the official statements as to the cause and results of the fire. First off was the lack of those skeletons. Jenny discussed the situation with a local crematorium and discovered that a body had to burn for at least 2 hours at a very high temperature to completely burn up human bones. Jenny puzzled over this, as the fire of her home burned for less than an hour at a much lower temperature than was needed to cremate a body. It was then obvious to George and Jenny that there should have been skeletons in the rubble. Other similar house fires had left complete skeletons within the wreckage. Various witnesses eventually came forward who claimed to have seen someone throwing fireballs at the house in the early morning of Christmas Day, had seen the children in a car driving away from the house while the fire burned, or had seen the children in the company of several adults in distant towns. George and Jenny thought that all this pointed to the fact that the children had not died, but had been kidnapped. But the legal authorities didn't believe them, much to their frustration, so they continued on with their own investigation. They went through all the remains of the house and eventually found what they thought was evidence that the authorities were right: a few bones and what seemed to be an inner organ. Surprisingly, after being tested, the bones turned out to be from a person older than any of the lost children, and the organ was a cow's liver. Thinking that somebody in the area must have seen something, they fashioned a billboard near their house with photos of the 5 missing children, and offering a reward for the return of the children. Nobody would ever attempt to claim that reward. Years went by, but George and Jenny refused to give up their search. Their investigation went nowhere until 1968, when Jenny received an anonymous envelope that contained a photo of a man. On the back was written, "Louis Sauter. I love Brother Frankie. LLIL Boys. A90132, or possibly A90135. The authorities were skeptical, but George and Jenny were convinced that the young man in the photo was their missing son, Louis. The authorities were skeptical, but George and Jenny were convinced that this young man in the photo was their missing son, Louis. That photograph was, in many ways, the conclusion of the entire story. George and Jenny eventually passed away, never knowing answers to questions such as, who moved the ladder? And why had neither of George's trucks worked, despite the fact that they were in perfect order the day before the fire? And where did those bones, found later at the site, and the cow's liver come from? There are currently many websites on the internet that feature the solutions to and discussions about the puzzling story. Amateur sleuths pore over the known facts in attempts to solve the crime, and still debate whether it was kidnapping or murder. The reward no longer stands, and the chances of coming up with the true story of this bizarre story at this late date is very slim indeed. Sylvia Sauter Paxton, the only remaining sibling alive from the 1945 Sauter house fire, passed away at age 79. Number 4. Ashland Tragedy, 1881, Ashland, Kentucky, December 23rd, 1881. The Gibson siblings, Fanny, age 14, and Robert, 17, were at home with a friend. Emma Carrico, age 15, better known with her stepfather's last name of Thomas. Emma's family lived just across the street from the Gibbons. Mrs. Gibbons had asked for the girl to come to stay while she was going to be out, to give her kids some company. Martha Gibbons, their mother, took the youngest son, Sterling, age 11, with her across the river into Ohio to visit with family for the night. John Gibbons, the father, was out of town for work. Early hours of December 24th, 1881. Mrs. Thomas, Emma's mother, got up early around 4 a.m. to start doing household chores. She glanced out the window and saw the Gibbons' home looked dark and assumed they were all still asleep. Around 6 a.m., she looked back over and noticed a strange flickering of light in the window. It took her a moment to process what she was seeing. Then she ran from her home, screaming, "Fire! Help! Fire!" As the fire alarm sounded, neighbors were woken and came out to help. Knowing there were children inside, they ran into the flames and pulled the three out. It was clear the bodies were Fanny, Robert, and Emma. But what shocked those who had gathered was that the three's heads had been smashed in. 3 physicians from town arrived on the scene, and they all concluded that the teenagers had died from having their skulls crushed, not the fire. As the physicians did further evaluation of the bodies, they found out that the girls had been brutally raped also. It was determined that the fire most likely had been set to cover up the crime. Ashland was a small, close-knit town where everyone knew each other, and this tragedy left everyone feeling uneasy. Who could have done this vicious act, and what could the townspeople do to catch them? 2 days after the murders, a service was held for the 3 teenagers at the Methodist Episcopal Church. There were so many in attendance, a large part of the crowd was left to gather outside. They were buried in a common grave in the Ashland Cemetery. Later that afternoon, the mayor of Ashland, John Means, called for a town meeting. He asked for donations so they could offer money for a reward and to hire a detective to hunt down the murderers. Within a few days, they had gathered over $1,000, over $25,000 in 2019. Private detectives from surrounding states, including Deputy U.S. Marshal Heflin, who quickly became the man the townspeople wanted to handle the case. When they get it all wrong. Another detective, J.B. Norris from Ohio, arrived with a theory. He believed that the killer had to be John Gibbons, the father of the house. From the outside, this doesn't seem to make sense. He was out of state at the time, and the girls were savagely raped. This didn't seem to fit. But newspapers started running the story, and the streets were lined with wanted posters for the arrest of John Gibbons. Marshal Heflin didn't believe it was the father, and pointed out that one man couldn't have carried out the crime alone. Unfortunately, people had already declared John Gibbons guilty before he had even been arrested. Heflin realized that they would have to bring the father in and clear his name before they would be able to focus on the real killers. December 31st, 1881. Heflin was able to track John Gibbons down to a remote area in West Virginia, where he had been working. First, he had to tell John what had happened to his children. The news hadn't reached him. Then, he had to bring him back to Ashland to clear his name. Heflin was able to prove that John had been in West Virginia the whole time working, and was not the killer. This blow landed Detective Morris running for the train with his head down. The townspeople were back to wondering who could have done it. Ashland's general store, Geiger, Powell, and Ferguson would play a part in bringing the killers to justice. That day, Mr. Powell waited on a regular named George Ellis, who wanted to purchase a cigar. Powell, making conversation, said, quote, "Well, now that old man Gibbons is in the clear, I wonder who it is going to fall on now." As soon as the remark was made, George Ellis looked startled. Suddenly, he wouldn't look up at Mr. Powell. Then Ellis blurted out that he might know who did it, and then he said something about state's evidence before quickly turning and walking out of the general store. Ellis started walking down the street, but he felt like everyone was watching him. He began to think they all knew what he had done. Did they know? He kept wondering. After hours spent walking, he made his decision. He walked to the hotel, then straight to the door of Marshall Heflin. Once inside, Ellis started to talk, telling Heflin that he lived near the Gibbons house and that he might know something about the murders. Ellis took a seat, then asked Heflin to explain to him the meaning of state's evidence, what Ellis had mumbled back at the general store. Heflin told him that if someone was guilty of a crime, informed on the others that were involved, that the informer would most likely get a lesser sentence. After hearing that, Ellis told Heflin he wanted to relieve his conscience and explain what happened. Marshall Heflin had interrogated quite a few criminals in his career and knew precisely what was needed to bring charges to get a jury to convict. One thing he knew he needed was a witness to the confession. Confession given by George Ellis to Marshall Heflin. A few evenings prior to the 24th, I met Kraft, who stated that he was going to see Fanny Gibbons and take her some black candy, and that he was going to have intercourse with her, and he wanted me to come along. About midnight, the fatal night, we all started Kraft, Neil, and myself, and when we got to the house, Kraft raised the window with an old axe and stepped in first. Neil followed, and I stayed behind on the porch, and afterwards, I went in. Robbie was the first aroused and started to get up when Kraft said, "You had better lie still." Kraft then went to the bed where the two girls were sleeping and began to take improper liberties with them. Robbie said, "You had better stay away from there," when Kraft hit him with the axe. He fell back on the lounge, then plunged forward and fell fully 6 feet from the bed under the stairs where he was found. The girl screamed when Kraft jumped on the bed, and they both said, "George Kraft, what are you here for?" Emma also started to jump from the bed when Neil choked her and pulled her onto the floor. She fought him, and I held her while he outraged her. Neil then struck her on the head with the big end of the crowbar, and she instantly died after throwing up her hands. Kraft also had some trouble with Fanny Gibbons, and he called on me to come and help him. He then outraged her and killed her. Neil proposed killing the girls, and after they were dead, I took some coal oil, poured it over the bodies, and set fire to them with a match. We then left the house. Ellis told Heflin that for months before the murders, his two friends had been watching the girls. One day, while they were working in the backyard, Emma passed by, and William Neal declared he was going to have carnal communication with her before Christmas. Ellis said that George Kraft had made similar remarks about Fanny. With Ellis's confession, both Neal and Kraft were arrested. The three men were transported to the county jail in Catlettsburg, about 5 miles away from Ashland. For whatever reason, all three prisoners were put in the same cell. The first thing the next morning, Ellis tried to recant his confession, saying it wasn't true, but was told it was too late. As word spread through Ashland that the killers were in jail, the talk of getting justice was overwhelming. So much so that officials believed the only way to get these men to trial would be to protect them until then. So the court ordered the prisoners to be moved to the more secure jail in Lexington. Being escorted by armed guards, the prisoners were put on the Catlettsburg ferry and headed down the river to Lexington. But the townspeople heard and boarded a steamboat to try to catch up with the ferry. Fortunately, the ferry eluded the steamboat. February 6th, 1882. The jury only deliberated for 17 minutes before finding William Neal guilty. They sentenced him to hang on February 14th, 1882. Only a few days later, George Kraft was convicted and sentenced to hang on the same day, and no one else died that night. February 1882. While in prison, George Ellis supposedly gave an interview with a Cincinnati newspaper, where he now told a completely different story. He said that he hired 2 black men to help him hold down the girls while he raped them. Then the 2 hired men killed the 3 teenagers. As he left the murder scene, he saw his 2 friends walking and decided to blame them if he got caught. But a few days later, after the story hit the papers, he claimed he had never given an interview to the newspaper. June 2nd, 1882. George Ellis was found guilty for his part in the murders and sentenced to life in prison since he had cooperated and testified against his co-conspirators. As the last man's trial was over, those involved hoped that this would bring some closure and let everyone start to heal from the tragedy. But that night, around midnight, a group of about 20 men, all wearing black hoods, overtook the engine house of the Chattaroy Railroad in Ashland. They ordered the watchmen to hook up a couple of flat cars to the engine house. They boarded the train and forced the drivers to take them to Catlettsburg, arriving around 3 a.m. across from the jail. They demanded to be let in, but were denied. They ended up storming the building and dragged George Ellis out with them. They took him back to Ashland on the train to make him pay for his crimes. Witnesses who had gathered to watch the hanging said that Ellis appeared calm and confessed again that it was him, Kraft, and Neal who had murdered the 3 teenagers. His only request was that his body wasn't mutilated. When he asked if he wanted to pray beforehand, he declined, saying he was ready to die. They hung him from a sycamore tree about 100 yards from the burned Gibbons home. His body hung there until the next afternoon, when the coroner cut it down. His death was ruled murder by person or persons unknown. June of 1882. Since the reward had not been paid after Neal and Kraft had been given new trials, people were still trying to cash in on it. A black detective from out of town showed up with 2 black men he claimed were the killers. At their first hearing, the charges were dismissed. When they left the courthouse, friends of the 2 men were waiting for the detective. They beat him, then shot him in the leg before local police could break the crowd up. Both Kraft and Neal appealed their convictions and won new trials. While the prisoners waited for new trials, they gave interviews with national newspapers, claiming George Ellis was crazy and that they were innocent. Tensions were higher than before when the prisoners were again moved from Lexington to Catlettsburg to start the trial. Governor G.W. Blackburn threatened to kill the whole county of Boyd if he had to have the law upheld. He refused to tolerate mob violence, he said. Kraft and Neal's attorneys demanded a change of venue. Judge George N. Brown granted it. The trials were now set to start in February 1883. Transporting the prisoners for their second trial. During this time, people were used to swift justice. So when a trial was being dragged out for years, it left people to believe they had every right to take justice into their own hands. Major Allen was commander of a militia group that was to guard the prisoners as they made their way from Lexington to Grayson in Carter County. They were initially going to transport the men by train, but Major Allen was worried about traveling through Ashland after hearing about the mob gathering. So Major Allen requisitioned a passing steamer, the Granite State, to head to Maysville in Carter County. While the steamer was being loaded with guards, a train from Ashland arrived with over 200 armed men and boys, demanding Neal and Kraft to be turned over. Major Allen refused, and the Granite State steamer left. The mob got back on the train and followed along the river and steamboat. Shortly after taking off, the mob started firing on the steamer, but the militia did not return fire. When the steamer reached Ashland, they were met with a crowd on the shoreline. The militia did not return fire, but instead created a barricade of sorts with items from the ship. A group of 20 or so in Ashland stole a ferry boat and attempted to intercept the steamer. As the ferry boat got close, they started to shoot, and now the militia returned fire. Most of the men on the ferry jumped into the water to avoid being shot, but the battle sent people everywhere shooting. In the end, 4 people were dead. Also, a relative of the murdered Gibbons' children had been shot 3 times. Another woman who was just waiting for a train was shot in the thigh. Early February 1883. Kraft went on trial first before Carter County Circuit Judge Rice. While the trial went on, the militia had to camp out in town. The weather was unseasonably cold with ice, sleet, mud, and snow covering everything. One guard died from exposure, and numerous others were hospitalized. After Kraft was asked if he had anything to say, "I can say one thing. I am not guilty of that charge. I did not have time to put all my witnesses here that I ought to have had, and I consider that I have not had a fair trial, for I know I am not guilty of that. I never as much as laid my hand on them. I never did. You might as well take a little innocent child and hang them as to hang me. The closest I was to Mrs. Gibbons' house that night was when I lay in bed at home asleep. I did not see the house, or George Ellis, or Bill Neal, or any of the children that night. The last time I saw any of Mrs. Gibbons' children was on the Wednesday before that. I saw little Fanny and spoke to her. That was the last time. I was aroused by the alarm of fire. I could, knowing the children were burned up, stand on the scaffold and hold my hand up and swear in the sight of heaven that I did not see those children, Neal or Ellis, that night. I am as innocent as the angels of that thing. I never thought of such a thing. I was better raised and had more respect for the people about me. I respected Mrs. Gibbons and her children. I am glad I can stand here and say that I am innocent. It's the truth. It is a put-up job. Gentlemen, the day is coming when I will be found innocent." Mrs. Gibbons started crying at his speech and interrupted, "Oh, my dear children, if they were only here now." She was led out of the courtroom, weeping. October 11th, 1883. Kraft was brought to Grayson for his hanging. The population of the small village was around 1,000, but that week it soared to over 3,000, who came to witness the killer meet the gallows. The night before, Kraft was kept in a prison cell with a barred window that his brothers and brothers-in-law gathered around telling stories and singing throughout the night. Kraft gave a speech where he once again proclaimed he was innocent of all crimes. Then he sang a hymn, "Did Christ Die for Sinners Weep?" then prayed out loud for God to save his soul. As he stepped onto the trap, he was crying and said, "Lord, receive my soul." And with that, the door swung open and his body fell. After another trial, William Neal was again found guilty and sentenced to die. Waiting for his execution, he was housed in Mount Sterling, Kentucky. He filed numerous appeals, which caused his execution to be delayed. March 3rd, 1885, Neal was loaded on the train and headed back to Grayson with no chance of further appeals. Everyone thought this was finally the end. Standing on the train platform, Neal gave his supporters who had gathered a short speech. "Farewell, good people. I hope to meet you in heaven. I am persecuted to my death by Campbell and Redland, who persecute themselves and bulldoze that lunatic George Ellis into swearing his lies against me. It's a fearful thing to walk upon the gallows and die for a crime I did not commit. Bear in mind that I will be proved innocent of this charge, just as I say now I am innocent. I have to be dragged back and hung like a dog for what I didn't do. I thank the citizens of Mount Sterling for their kindness to me. I hope to see you in a better land." But in the end, the execution was postponed, and Neal was returned to Mount Sterling. The next afternoon, he was led to the gallows and gave another speech to the nearly 3,000 visitors who had come to watch. "My friends, I say to one and all, you all know there is no place to tell a lie. I stand here today to suffer for a heinous crime I did not commit. One day my innocence will be established beyond a doubt. I bid you one and all goodbye. O Lord, thou knows I am innocent. Into thy hands I commit my soul. I am innocent." The last words escaped his mouth just before the trap door flew open. Neal's family did not attend the hanging, but later claimed his body. They had it buried in the back property of his father-in-law's land near Catlettsburg. The tree that was used to hang George Ellis stood until 1903. At the time, it was in the yard of the Standard Furniture Company. The Gibbons' home was torn down after the fire, but it was located at what is now the corner of 28th Street and Carter Avenue. Number 3. We finally know who killed JonBenet Ramsey. AmericaNow.com. In 1996, JonBenet, a child beauty queen, was found beaten and strangled to death in her family's cellar just hours after her mother, Patsy, called 911 to report she had been kidnapped. To this day, no charges have been filed in the case, and there has been much speculation about who may be responsible. In the early morning hours of December 26, 1996, John and Patsy Ramsey awoke to find their 6-year-old daughter, JonBenet Ramsey, missing from her bed at the home in Boulder, Colorado. Patsy and John had woken up early to prepare for a trip when Patsy discovered a ransom note on the stairs demanding $118,000 for their daughter's safe return. Despite the note's warning not to involve police, Patsy immediately called them, as well as friends and family, in order to aid in the search for JonBenet Ramsey. Police arrived at 5:55 a.m. and found no signs of forced entry, but did not search the basement, where her body would eventually be found. During the autopsy, it was discovered that JonBenet Ramsey had died from asphyxiation due to strangulation, in addition to a skull fracture. Her mouth had been covered in duct tape, and her wrists and neck were wrapped with a white cord. Her torso had been covered in a white blanket. There was no conclusive evidence of rape, as no semen was found on the body, and her vagina appeared to have been wiped clean, although a sexual assault had occurred. The makeshift garret was made using a length of cord and part of a paintbrush from the basement. The coroner also found what was believed to be a pineapple in JonBenét's stomach. Her parents do not remember giving her any the night before she died, but there was a bowl of pineapple in the kitchen which had her 9-year-old brother Burke's fingerprints on it. However, this meant little since time cannot be attributed to fingerprints. The Ramseys maintained Burke was in his room all night asleep, and there was never any physical evidence to reflect otherwise. There are two popular theories in the Ramsey case: the family theory and the intruder theory. The initial investigation focused heavily on the Ramsey family for many reasons. The police felt that the ransom note was staged, as it was unusually long, written using a pen and paper from the Ramseys' house, and demanded almost the exact amount of money that John had received as a bonus earlier that year. Additionally, the Ramseys were reluctant to cooperate with police, though they later said that this was because they feared the police would not conduct a full investigation and target them as easy suspects. However, all three family members of the immediate family were questioned by investigators and submitting handwriting samples to compare to the ransom letter. Both John and Burke were clear of any suspicion of writing the note, although much was made that Patsy could not be conclusively cleared by her handwriting sample. This analysis was not further supported by any other evidence. There was a boot print found next to JonBenét's body, which did not belong to anyone in the family. There was also a broken window in the basement, which was believed to be the most likely point of entry for an intruder. Additionally, there was DNA from drops of blood from an unknown male found on her underwear. The floors in the Ramseys' house were heavily carpeted, making it plausible for an intruder to have carried JonBenet downstairs without waking the family. One of the most famous suspects was John Carr. He was arrested in 2006 when he confessed to killing JonBenet by accident. After he had drugged and sexually assaulted her, Carr was eventually dismissed as a suspect after it was revealed that no drugs had been found in JonBenet's system. Police could not confirm he was in Boulder at the time, and his DNA did not match the profile generated from the samples found. In 2016, CBS aired The Case of JonBenet Ramsey, which implied her then 9-year-old brother Burke was the killer, despite the fact he was cleared by the DNA evidence that proved the existence of an intruder. Burke filed a $750 million lawsuit against CBS for defamation. The case was settled in 2019, and while the terms of the settlement were never disclosed, his lawyer stated the case was amicably resolved to the satisfaction of all parties. The JonBenet Ramsey case is still open and remains unsolved. Number 2. The Lawson Family Murders. It starts in 1927 when Charles Lawson, his wife, Fanny, and his 7 children moved to a farm in Germantown, North Carolina, a small town north of Winston-Salem. Shortly before Christmas, 1929, Charles Lawson took his wife and their 7 children, Marie, age 17, Arthur, 16, Carrie, 12, Maybelle, 7, James, 4, Raymond, 2, and Mary Lou, 4 months old, into town to buy new clothes and have a family portrait taken. On the afternoon of December 25th, Marie, the eldest sister, was baking a cake for Christmas. Charles Lawson first shot his young daughters Carrie and Maybelle with a 12-gauge shotgun and placed their bodies in the tobacco barn. He then returned to the house and shot his wife, Fanny. When teenage Marie heard the gunshot that killed her mother, she screamed, and the 2 youngest boys, James and Raymond, ran and tried to hide from the terror that was unfolding. Charles then proceeded to kill Marie, eventually found the boys and killed them as well. Charles then killed his 4-month-old baby, Mary Lou. It is said she was beaten to death. Several hours later, Charles went into the nearby woods and committed suicide. The bodies of the family members were found with their arms crossed and rocks under their heads. Arthur, the eldest son, was the only survivor of the family, as he was sent out on an errand just before the crime was committed. Sadly, in 1945, Arthur was killed in a car accident at the age of 32. After the murders, one of Charles's brothers, Marion Lawson, opened the house as a tourist attraction. In the 5 years the house was on display, it brought thousands of people, inspiring many songs and even a movie, The Carolina Buddies, Murder of the Lawson Family. Number 1. Valdez's Christmas Present, 2013, Chicago, Illinois. Alexis Valdez, aged 18, had been living with his aunt and her boyfriend and was supposed to be helping pay the bills, but he had stopped working. After several arguments about the expenses, Valdez was asked to move out. On Christmas Eve, while the aunt was attending a party, Valdez started drinking and became angry at being forced to move out, according to prosecutors. At some point, Diaz came home to the apartment and went with Valdez to a store to buy more beer. Sawyer says Valdez hit a hammer by the door and smashed Diaz in the head several times when they returned from the store. When Diaz was dead, Valdez dismembered the body, eventually cutting off Diaz's head as he played loud music to conceal his actions, according to prosecutors. Valdez also used a butcher knife to cut off Diaz's ears, nose, and mouth. Sawyer said, and also pulled out Diaz's eyes with his bare hands. He also cut off Diaz's arms and sliced the dead man's torso from his neck to his pelvis, Sawyer said. Valdez left the head, ears, and nose on Diaz's bed because he wanted to leave his aunt a present, Sawyer said in court. Valdez eventually became exhausted from cutting up the body, Sawyer said. He called 911 to report a dead body. When the 911 operator asked Valdez if he tried CPR, quote, the defendant laughed and told the 911 operator that the victim had been decapitated, unquote, Sawyer said. When police arrived, Valdez was covered in blood and admitted to killing Diaz, and would have killed his aunt as well if she had come home, Sawyer said.